Hello, fellow researchers. Welcome to my research presentation. My name is Kaylee Herndon, and I will be doing my research on discovering the connection between childhood trauma and autoimmune disease. Let's jump right into it. Now, my research question is, what is the relationship between autoimmune diagnoses and adverse childhood experiences, which is also known as ACEs? My hypothesis is I believe that there will be a positive correlation between people who are diagnosed with autoimmune diseases and a score of 3 or higher on the ACE quiz. Now, before we jump into the actual bulk of the research, I want to define a couple of my variables. One is the autoimmune disease. What is it? According to McKay, author of The Autoimmune Disease, an autoimmune disease is a condition in which tissue injury is caused by T cell or antibody reactivity to self. Now, I don't know about you, but when I first read that, I was like, I'm not a scientist. What do they mean exactly? Now, I'll break it down for you in normal people terms. When one's immune system is barely working, it may cause this immune dysfunction. Or, on the other hand, it could be on high alert. When on high alert, the body attacks its own cells and tissues. And on the other hand, when it is under functioning, the body isn't able to fight off invaders, which makes one more susceptible to diseases. Another variable that I want to define is ACE scores, aka adverse childhood experiences, aka childhood trauma. According to the CDC, adverse childhood experiences are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. Kaiser Permanente created this test that quantifies one's experience of trauma in childhood and gives you a score, which is the one that I will be using in this research. So before we dive in, I want to say a few things about this, including my own why I'm doing this. The events this quiz measures are explaining and experiencing violence, abuse, neglect in physical or emotional ways, as well as witnessing violence in the home or community. It also asks for experiences or substance misuse, mental health problems or instability due to divorce, or parental figures being in jail or prison. So below are some autoimmune diseases. I personally have 2 diagnoses. You'll see one of them is on here. It's Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Another one is called PCOS. As someone who is diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, or 2, I have been part of communities and groups of people with similar diagnoses. I started to notice a trend among these women. And yes, they are just women that I'm working with. Many diagnosed with an autoimmune disease have experienced relational or physical trauma in their childhood. With this in mind, I wanted to do research on these 2 variables. Many of the symptoms that are first seen in these diagnoses are gut issues. This is why I have listed the progression and visuals to explain this. We know from previous research that the connection between the brain and gut is very significant and can have many implications. Hormones such as cortisol, which are linked to stress, also have an impact on one's physical health and can deteriorate one's immunity. I want to note that I did not be able to test on groups that I am a part of, and nor did I want to, since I have close relationships with some of the people in the group. This leads us into methods. For this research study, the timeline was not long. I did not do this study over a period of time since they already have developed the autoimmune disorder. This study's time orientation is in the past, looking at their current diagnoses and their past childhood trauma. This project was conducted in one phase. The participants were taken from Facebook groups that consisted of people with autoimmune diseases. It is a forum of such. The survey was shared to the group and 30 people anonymously volunteered to participate in this study. A questionnaire was given to participants. They were directed to this website that's listed on the screen to take the ACE quiz and to come back with their overall score. They were instructed to not share any information about the content of the quiz in relation to their answers. They then came back to the survey and gave their overall score. Again, no other personal information was given. Just as a caveat, they were then asked as an optional question, completely voluntary, what their specific autoimmune diagnosis was. There is not significant research on how childhood trauma is related to autoimmune disease in general. Many of the studies look at specific diseases, but not an overall approach to autoimmune diagnosis. I chose to do a quantitative study rather than a qualitative study because I wanted to look at the number in the population of this community rather than the collective experience. Now let's look at the relevant literature. In the Journal of Science, titled The Physicalized Mind and the Gut-Brain Axis, it shows that there is a continuous and stacking evidence that proves one, mental health does not occur in a disembodied state, but in a complex physical environment that is strongly influenced by environmental factors. They go on to say that it is the brain that can send signals to the gut, and the gut can return signals to the brain, which supports the idea that our physical health is directly related to our mental health, and vice versa. This literature in particular is what motivated for me to look more into this. The role of the gut microbiome is extensively included in the research, which is why I wanted to include some of it here, because it is a major key element in the cause of autoimmune diseases. There is a lot of relevant literature on this that shows a direct correlation between one's ACE score and further autoimmune diagnoses. They make connections that intestinal dysbiosis is linked to behavioral impairment, stimulating extensive research into the role of gut microbiota in mental neurological health. One case study on the childhood trauma and irritable bowel syndrome suggests that alterations in stress response resulting from childhood traumatic events could potentially contribute to IBS symptoms by altering the HPA axis and promoting dysfunctional processing of visceral sensory motor events. Because of time restrictions, we can't get into it, but I would suggest looking into that one specifically because the HPA axis involves and was mentioned in many research in this area. It has a lot to do with your gut and stress and the events in your life, specifically childhood trauma. In another study, Lynch, Waite, and Davey look at the connection between adverse childhood experiences and diabetes. They found the following when looking at ACEs scores. The results of the cumulative ACEs score was in the expected direction and was significant, suggesting that participants who were cumulatively reported experiencing more childhood trauma were more likely to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in adulthood. Another study found that with higher ACE scores indicating a greater risk for several health and social problems throughout the lifespan, ACE scores of 4 or more are of particular concern. This specific research enabled me and inspired me to look at ACE scores of 3 or more. They find significance in 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. Findings. I would like to direct your attention to the charts that are labeled ACE scores. These show that there is significant relationships, a highly significant relationship, in fact, to being diagnosed with an autoimmune disease and to having a higher score of 3 or more on the ACE score quiz. There is an 87% higher score of 3 or more. As you can see, 2 or 1 has barely any participants, and the significance is between the scores of 3 and 6, which is also noted that none were reported to have more than 6. So as I said, the p-value is 0.05, which is statistically significant. This was also, I mentioned, this other graph is a bonus, as I would say. This is looking at the autoimmune diagnosis specifically because I asked them as an optional question what specific diagnosis they had They came back with a range of them, including celiac disease, diabetes, PCOS, which stands for polycystic ovarian syndrome, endometriosis, IBS, Hashimoto's, lupus, PCOS, and it does show a couple times on here. Lupus. And the last one is one that they didn't mention. They said NA. It is significant. The significance is found in irritable bowel syndrome, which is interesting to note because of that gut correlation to the brain correlation. These are also the references, which I highly recommend looking up because they're quite interesting. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something, as I did, that there is significance between the ACE score, aka childhood trauma, and being diagnosed later on with an autoimmune diagnosis. Thank you. Bye.